Alrighty, and we are live, guys. Welcome to Staking Mondays. My name is Ken. I'm here with the co-founder of Staking Rewards, Merkel Schmiedel, and today we have with us MacLane Wilkison, the co-founder and CEO of NuCypher. NuCypher is a data privacy layer blockchain, and today we have with us MacLane Wilkison. Sorry for that echo, guys. And of course, NuCypher is a privacy layer for blockchain and decentralized applications. MacLane is also a major contributor to the Threshold network. He's a software engineer and former tech, media, and telecommunications investment banker at Morgan Stanley. Well, let's jump right into it, guys. Lightning round of questions. MacLane, what was your first investment outside of BTC and ETH?
Hey, everybody. Thanks for having me on. So first investment outside of BTC, or did you say also, so my first investment outside of BTC was actually ETH. So I got started in blockchain. I was working out of a co-working space in south of San Francisco called Hacker Dojo. And this was back in 2013, 2014. And I remember that they were having some weird meetup about something called smart contracts, which I had no idea what that was, but I wandered into the room and Vitalik was on his roadshow, for the ETH ICO, and basically telling everyone about this thing that he was working on. So I ended up participating in basically throwing the small amounts of Bitcoin that I owned at the time into the ETH ICO and participating there, and then obviously falling down the rabbit hole of Bitcoin and ETH and everything else over the next few months and years.
That's awesome. Great story there. And what do you think currently, what is the most underrated crypto project outside of like Threshold and NuCypher?
Most underrated crypto project. I think actually Gearbox is a super interesting one. So that's basically almost like composable leverage protocol. So I'm actually using that. I think they have like a guarded launch where they're only offering a certain amount. I think it's like 4x leverage. I'm using that to yield farm stable coins. I think I'm super excited for the stuff that they're working on over the next few months and as they sort of scale up and launch their V2.
Very cool. And yield farming stablecoins, sound strategy. Which alternative crypto privacy project inspired you most?
I mean, I think Zcash is obviously like the one that a lot of people look to as really doing an amazing job of like introducing what at the time was very cutting edge and new to cryptography that people hadn't been used in production earnestly until sort of Zcash first did it with ZKPs. And I think that's what's super exciting about the crypto space in general is that you're able to sort of bring these very new, very novel and exciting crypto primitives into production much more quickly, into a much more sort of like amenable audience who's interested to try these things out than outside the space.
Cool. And who in the crypto industry do you respect the most, or like who inspired you the most during your crypto journey?
I think I've been super fortunate at NuCypher to work with some amazing people, including the co-founder of NuCypher, who I worked with a lot in the early days, Michael Egorov, who now is the founder of Curve. So I think that the early team at NuCypher, incredibly underrated and has spawned out a bunch of very interesting projects. So Michael with Curve, Tux now more recently with Entropy, Ravital with Sunscreen. So there's been an unbelievably strong group of early contributors in NuCypher that I was incredibly fortunate to have worked with.
Awesome and refreshing answer as well. Most of our guests, default right to Vitalik, but it's great to hear that Michael was here.
I mean, I respect Vitalik a lot as well, of course.
And how much of your portfolio is currently staked? Give me a percentage.
I mean, percentage-wise, it's got to be upwards of, well, depending on what you mean by staked. So upwards of 75%, I would imagine. Well, essentially all of my ETH is staked with Lido and ETH2. And then obviously like if you consider the leverage stablecoin farming that I'm doing with Gearbox, that's LP'd. So I don't know if that would be considered staked or not.
Yeah, more or less, I think. So, and then what is an activity you do to relax from wild crypto markets? What do you do for fun?
Yeah, so I've lived out here in Texas for about a year and a half after moving here from the Bay Area, and there's a lot of good hiking and national parks around, with rivers and interesting ways to sort of escape the city and relax a little bit and decompress. So we like to do that.
That's cool. Amazing. And guys, stay tuned for the episode here. Today we'll talk about future of privacy tokens, issues with multi-chain bridges. We talk about how much Bitcoin will be bridged to Ethereum, and we talk about decentralized mergers. So stay tuned here. It's going to be a great episode, and I'm really looking forward to it. Also, make sure to drop some questions here if you have anything for MacLane. Just put it in the chat box, and we'll answer it at the end of the show.
Absolutely. And today's episode is sponsored by Lido Finance. Funny we mention it. Lido is the market-leading liquid staking solution. With Lido, you can stake your Ethereum, Solana, and Terra while keeping full liquidity via staking derivatives. The staking derivatives you use in multiple DeFi applications to generate additional yield. And of course, guys, keep those community questions coming throughout the episode here. We'll be sure to ask at the end. All right, MacLane. So what led to NuCypher and Keep network merging?
Yeah, so NuCypher and Keep both have been around as projects since at least 2017. If in NuCypher's case, more like 2016. But they've sort of been sort of around the block in terms of crypto projects. But at this point, both 4-ish years old, and we had been aware of each other, interacted with each other at conferences and just different events in the space, and of all the different projects in the ecosystem, Keep and NuCypher were like, Keep was the closest to NuCypher in terms of, I think, architecture. In other words, it's like a layer 2, sort of quasi layer 2 network that sits on top of Ethereum with a work token that provides a service. And both were focused on threshold cryptography. And so it was almost like looking in a weird mirror a little bit when we would look over at Keep, and I'm sure the same for them looking at NuCypher. And I think it became like pretty obvious that eventually these two networks were going to converge towards the same or very similar use cases. So one of those was obviously like the sort of cross-chain asset bridges use case that Keep has with TBTC. And then another big use case was the one that we were more focused on in the near term around data privacy and access control with proxy re-encryption. And I think it became kind of obvious that like, okay, like we could either basically our two communities and two networks and two sets of stakers and node operators and ecosystems could stay separate and basically compete with each other over these same use cases. Or maybe there's some way that we could figure out a way to basically smush together these two networks and these two communities and do everything on one platform and in one ecosystem. And if we were able to do that, I think the question was then like, is that more powerful and more valuable and just more effective and more useful for the world than if we were to just continue as two separate independent networks?
That's amazing. And it is certainly like one of the first times in history that has been done. I know there are a few others like Polygon, they also like acquired some other like decentralized networks and so on. But like for you, like NuCypher and Keep and like merging the two teams and merging the technology and everything, like what was the biggest challenge for you guys that you faced and still facing as well?
Yeah, so I think what's super interesting about the NuCypher Keep threshold merger is that it was truly a decentralized merger, in that it's the networks that are getting merged together, not the contributing teams, not the NuCypher dev team, the Keep dev team are separate entities still, and basically both have become essentially like client teams or contributing teams to this new combined network. But the entire process was bottoms up. So you can go back and look at the respective governance forums for both projects. And you can kind of see like the initial proposals and then the iterations of those proposals as community members basically collaborated and iterated on this design and trying to figure out some sort of structure that would make sense for both networks, both communities, and all the different stakeholders within those networks. So it's like that was the most challenging piece. Is it was trying to basically invent this process for how to do a decentralized merger, which is run by the respective communities. And you have to get buy-in from like a huge number of stakeholders, which is not necessarily the case in a traditional like M&A, like centralized approach where you have two management teams, two board of directors that basically can have a fiduciary duty for the rest of the shareholders and can make those decisions. And when you're merging two decentralized networks, you have two sets of token holders, you have two sets of stakers, you have a bunch of different infrastructure providers on the network that are running nodes for people. You have centralized custodians, you have decentralized exchanges, you have LPs. So it becomes like very complex very quickly. And figuring out how to align the incentives of all of those different participants in the network in the open, in public, on Discord channels and discourse forums is very difficult. But I think it was very difficult, but also a very fun and sort of interesting and novel experience to witness.
Yeah, and interesting that you have some M&A experience from a traditional finance background earlier in life as well, and maybe that helped you work through that process of this decentralized merger. So, what happens to the new and keep contracts and tokens once the merge has been fully completed?
Sure. So both the new and keep token contracts are, of course, immutable ERC20 token contracts. They can't be changed. We can't force people to migrate to T. Basically, people have to opt in to this new network. So if you are a new token holder or a keep token holder, you can essentially upgrade your tokens into T at a fixed conversion ratio using what we call the vending machine upgrade contracts. So basically, you wrap your existing tokens in the vending machine contract and you receive back the upgraded T tokens. So that's the token contracts. And then, of course, like both networks and systems have a set of other smart contracts that run like the service, the protocol that's being provided by the protocol. In the case of NuCypher, there's like a staking contract and a policy manager contract for proxy re-encryption. And so the staking contract basically is responsible, obviously, for holding stakers tokens in escrow, and then also emitting inflation rewards to stakers. So what happened as part of the merge process is that NuCypher stakers basically voted to freeze the inflation and stop inflation, so that the total supply of NuCypher tokens is now frozen forever. And that allowed us to basically fix the NuCypher to T conversion factor. And so that required basically a DAO proposal and vote to pass that on chain. And so once that happened, basically we were able to deploy the contracts. People were able to start migrating over. And the problem, or one of the more sort of thorny technical problems we had with the merger was that a lot of people, like I think it's about 60% of the network, had their tokens staked and locked in that staking escrow contract. And so we needed some way basically to grandfather those people into Threshold network while they're still locked up in that staking contract. There's a very similar situation on the Keep side where they have a lot of stakers that are locked as well. And so we basically had to do a lot of work on this new Threshold staking contract to basically grandfather those people in and be able to recognize the existing legacy, new, and Keep stakes as valid T stakes. And then eventually those stakes will unlock and they'll be able to, formally upgrade those now liquid tokens into T. But in the interim, basically, like the Threshold staking contract kind of has to understand that those contracts exist and recognize them as valid stakes.
Really cool. And it's great to see that you really gone like through that process of creating like a truly decentralized merger process, which is amazing. And alongside that, like you're also going to be launching like the first truly decentralized Bitcoin to Ethereum bridge. Correct me if I'm wrong, like the TBTC Bridge version 2.
Yep.
Like how does that work in detail, and like what are the risks? Maybe you can walk us a little bit through that bridge design.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. We're super excited about TBTC V2, and TBTC, for those who don't know, is a decentralized Bitcoin bridge, V1 of which ran on the Keep network. And then there was a group of NuCypher community members who were exploring the viability of building like a new BTC, and that was kind of one of the drivers for the community to pursue this merge, is because we thought, hey, instead of launching like a competitive version of that, we can collaborate on version 2 of TBTC and hopefully build something better. And so basically from V1 to V2, in V1, basically the way that it works is you replace this idea of a centralized custodian. So if you take wrapped Bitcoin as a comparable, you have Bitcoin, you want to use it on Ethereum or some other smart contract platform. You send your Bitcoin to a centralized custodian like BitGo. They hold on to it for you. They issue you a tokenized representation of that on Ethereum or some other chain. TBTC essentially just replaces that centralized custodian with a decentralized network of signers using distributed key generation and threshold signatures. And in V1, that was a 3 of 3 signer set. And each of those signers basically had to put up, they had to over collateralize. So they had to over collateralize the Bitcoin that they would custody by 150% in ETH, which meant basically that it was very, very expensive in terms of opportunity cost to be a signer and a staker in that network. And so basically what that ended up doing in practice is it limited the minting capacity for TBTC V1 because you always had to keep over collateralizing in order to increase the capacity. TBTC V2 basically tries to fix that by removing the collateralization requirement entirely and relying on an honest majority assumption with an insurance backstop. And so what that means in practice is signer sets go from 3 of 3 to 51 of 100. And for each deposit, basically you select a signer set of 100 signers out of the stakers and threshold network, which is several thousand. And then as long as 51 of 100 of them agree and reach quorum, they can mint or redeem Bitcoin. And then of course that opens the possibility of, in an extreme case of collusion, if 51 of 100 of those signers collude or become malicious and steal Bitcoin, there is a insurance backstop that's called the coverage pools. And the coverage pools basically would be used to backstop any kind of economic loss for depositors in the event of a long tail collusion event. So people can deposit initially T tokens and potentially in the future other assets as well into that coverage pool, and they'll earn a yield for doing that. And then that would serve as this sort of ultimate final backstop in the unlikely scenario that there is a malicious signer set. And so the idea is to basically remove this, for all practical purposes, have removed the minting capacity limit. And so TBTC V2 can scale up to very high amounts. I think we have an initial goal of 100,000 Bitcoin. And then hopefully, I think as it proves itself over time, we want to attract a lot more incremental Bitcoin that's never bridged over to Ethereum, never bridged into DeFi, because they would never trust a centralized custodian. But maybe they would trust a proven decentralized immutable network.
That's amazing. And so the staking economics of threshold networks, they basically are the insurance fund for any BTC that's bridged, right? And does it mean that the more BTC is bridged, it's going to be a price pressure or price appreciation for the T tokens? Because it always has to be kind of in line, right? With the price of the coverage pool and the BTC bridge.
Yeah, so I don't want to directly comment on price, but I think your understanding is probably more or less correct. But I will say there's two components here. We don't consider coverage pool staking. So coverage pools is a very essentially passive deposit. You deposit your tokens into the coverage pool, you receive a yield for taking on that risk and basically being paid for being effectively an insurance backstop. But you don't have to run a node if you're deposited into the coverage pools. Now, if you're staking on the threshold network, that does imply running a node. So you stake in threshold, and then you authorize the different applications that you want to run a node for in threshold network. One of those is being a TBTC V2 signer. Another could be running a random beacon node. Another could be running a proxy encryption node. And you can basically reuse the same stake across applications. So if you want to maximize your rewards and your payments, you would just run all of the services. So there's two components. If you're staking, that implies the active participation of running a node, being a signer, sort of making sure that you're keeping up with all the software upgrades for the nodes and all of that. And then if you're depositing into the coverage pools, you're not having to do that sort of active running of a node. So it's more similar to being like an LP, for example, in like a V2 pool.
Very, very interesting. And you kind of already mentioned the 100,000 BTC that you want to target as a goal to bridge over here. But how much BTC do you expect to be bridged? And further than that 100K, what are your targets in the next, call it 2 to 5 years?
Sure. So I think there's around like 20K BTC that's like soft committed to the bridge. And then I think in the near term, obviously the goal is that we want to provide one, yield opportunities for people to earn yield on their Bitcoin, and then two, other ways to use their Bitcoin. For example, taking out loans. So there's actually a super interesting community-driven project for Threshold called Threshold USD, and this team is basically in the process of forking Liquidity, which is a ETH lending protocol, and replacing ETH with TBTC. And so basically, if you're a Bitcoin holder, you can use the bridge, the V2 bridge, to cross over into ETH. You can take out a loan in Threshold USD against your Bitcoin, and then now you have, you do whatever you want with that Threshold USD. You can go pursue yield opportunities with it. You can swap it to USDC or Tether and go buy a house. And I think that actually Threshold USD is a super interesting project in its own right, even beyond like the benefits it has for TBTC, but it's now like a decentralized Bitcoin-backed stablecoin, which I think is a pretty interesting primitive for DeFi, just in its own right. So that's what we're focused on right now, is basically just creating these opportunities, yield opportunities, consumption opportunities, use opportunities for people on the other side of the bridge, and hopefully attracting a lot of, frankly, like WBTC's market share over into TBTC in the short term. And then in the longer term, just bridging over a bunch of idle Bitcoin that so far has never engaged with DeFi previously.
That's cool. And do you see any other use cases outside of like using it as collateral for Bitcoin on Ethereum? And like what do you think in general is like the future of Bitcoin on Ethereum, or like of Bitcoin in general as well? Like do you think like most of it would be bridged there because there's so much utility on Ethereum then for it?
Yeah. So I think using it as collateral to take out loans or to lend out is one big use case. Another big use case would be like yield farming opportunities. So just LPing in pool twos with Bitcoin. That we actually have, there is a TBTC V2 pool on Curve right now that's not incentivized yet, but Threshold DAO is building up a lot of its own protocol owned liquidity and Curve and Convex governance power. So I expect that the DAO would want to sort of direct some CRV and CVX emissions to that TBTC V2 pool at some point in the future. We also, I think there's pools on Saddle and MStable as well that are currently incentivized. So there will be sort of these other yield opportunities to earn with your Bitcoin once you've crossed the bridge. And then, sorry, can you repeat? What was the second part of the question?
Just like for Bitcoin in general, like do you think
what it'll end up happening? Yeah. So obviously, like the focus for the bridge is first on ETH L1. But what's interesting about how we've done the V2 bridge is that we separated the minting component and the custody component. So you can custody BTC on the V2 bridge, and then theoretically you don't even have to mint TBTC. So you could custody and just take out a loan in Threshold USD potentially without ever minting a token. So for people in certain tax jurisdictions, you might want to avoid, for example, like some sort of tax event, or it's pretty straightforward for us to start adding the ability to mint on L2s, on other smart contract platforms that have demand for Bitcoin and that have yield opportunities or other usage opportunities for BTC holders. So that's something that I think we would look to do once we've got the bridge running on ETH L1, is launching on some of these L2s, potentially launching on non-EVM chains as well if they have a strong DeFi ecosystem where there's opportunities for Bitcoin holders.
Yeah, this is all super exciting. I know a few family members and friends that have been waiting to unlock the full potential of their Bitcoin and start participating in DeFi. So this bridge, certainly seems like a good way to do that. So what are the further use cases for the Threshold network after the TBTC bridge?
Yep. So basically the first application that'll be launching on Threshold even before TBTC, or V2, which is probably going to happen in Q2. But the first application will be proxy re-encryption. And proxy re-encryption is the primitive that was running on the NuCypher network previously. And proxy re-encryption is primarily used for data privacy and access controls. So the idea is that, if you are, let's say I don't know if this is in practice a good use case, but it's easy to understand. Let's say you're building a medical records application that you want to make decentralized, and you want people to upload their encrypted medical records to IPFS or some decentralized storage layer. You could do that today. You encrypt the medical records, you upload them, but at that point, you as the patient, of course, are the only one who can access them because you're the only one with the private key. But it's only useful if you can actually grant access or share that data with your doctor, hospital, insurance provider. And so what proxy re-encryption allows you to do is it allows you a node can basically re-encrypt data from one key into another key atomically without decrypting in the middle. So you as the patient can say, hey, I want to share my data. Hey, NuCypher, now Threshold Network, I want to share my data with Dr. Bob. And the network can re-encrypt the data so that Dr. Bob can decrypt it with his private key. And what's special about that is the NuCypher network, the Threshold network, never see the data. They just re-encrypt it. The storage layer never sees the data. They just see encrypted data in, encrypted data out. And so you can build this end-to-end encrypted access control layer, which fits very well kind of in this decentralized public network context, using Threshold proxy re-encryption as a primitive. And so there's a bunch of projects that are building, different types of applications with that. One, a popular sort of use pattern is conditional encryption, where you're a content creator, you're creating some kind of content, whether it's an encrypted video stream, songs, like decentralized Spotify or something, and you only want people to have access to that if they've made some sort of payment to your address or if they've subscribed, for example. And so you could condition this re-encryption or this access on such a payment.
That's beautiful. Yeah, I can really see that being extremely useful in a world of blockchains where everything is completely transparent, and obviously you don't want to share anything all your private details and everything, but you still want to utilize blockchains. So yeah, 100% see that use case there. Going back a little bit to the bridges, or general those bridges are kind of thresholds, we could say, and where do you see the biggest problems, or the most common problems of all the bridges in the current multi-chain universe?
Yeah. So I think with Threshold, the design for V2 is very well, specifically designed for Bitcoin, and I guess Bitcoin forks are also theoretically good fit. So you can imagine the V2 design would be a sort of an optimal bridge for forks of Bitcoin, like Bitcoin Cash, Doge, etc. And the reason is that Bitcoin doesn't have sophisticated, very rich smart contracts, so you can't actually custody tokens in a smart contract like you might be able to do with more expressive chains. So I think you theoretically can use the same V2 bridge design to connect any chains like Ethereum to Solana or wherever. But I don't know I can't say for sure. I'm not an expert on the other bridges. I don't know if the V2 design is optimal for bridging smart contract platforms to each other, whereas it is optimal in our view for bridging Bitcoin to other chains or other smart contract platforms. So we are also hyper focused on Bitcoin specifically to start, for that reason, and also for the reason that Bitcoin is still the largest crypto asset by a very significant margin, and we want to unlock that, basically unlock that as collateral for all of DeFi. But I think the biggest issue with the existing Bitcoin bridges is that, frankly, they're centralized, and which is fine if you live in certain jurisdictions. If you live in the U.S. and you're able to do KYC, AML for BitGo, and they're willing to serve you as a customer, like it works fairly well. But ultimately, you're still reliant on this centralized custodian to stay in business, to do what they say they're going to do. Which, if you're a hardcore Bitcoin OG and you're like strongly leaning into the not your keys, not your coins ethos, that might not be acceptable for you. And then if you're outside of the US or outside of Europe, or in a country where you're not able to easily pass BitGo's KYC AML requirements, you're basically like, if you live in China or a lot of countries in the world, you're straight up out of luck. Like, you're not going to ever be able to do business with WBTC, and TBTC is just a protocol. So you just interact with a smart contract. It's permissionless. It's decentralized. It's open for anyone to use.
Yeah, speaking even more on decentralized nature being a benefit, what if your country undergoes sanctions like we're seeing with the current world news, and that affects your ability to interact with these centralized custodians? Yeah, so there's so many reasons why a decentralized solution makes sense here. So getting back into the staking economics discussion, what are the main differences between staking economics of NuCypher and Threshold Network?
Sure. So I think with Threshold Network, the main difference between Threshold and NuCypher and Keep is that Threshold is a multi-application network, whereas NuCypher was just proxy encryption. Keep was more or less just TBTC. And so that was the most challenging aspect of designing like the Threshold staking system. Was one, we have to account for multiple applications, and we have to account for the possibility to add more applications in the future. So making it modular from an application standpoint. And then also on the other side of that, we had to account for people that staked just vanilla T. And then we also had to grandfather in, like I said before, the existing legacy, new, and Keep stakers. So we had to kind of make it semi-modular on that side as well. And so that was fairly complicated. And then in terms of, in other aspects, we tried to simplify things. So NuCypher and Keep, both started back 2017, 2016, when like this sort of the staking ecosystem was much less mature and less sophisticated. And so there were certain design choices that we made that, I think were the right choices at the time, but just weren't the direction that the industry went in. So for example, in the NuCypher staking mechanism, you would pre-specify at the time of staking how long you wanted to stake for. And the longer that you pre-specified, up to a year, like the higher the rewards you would get. But in the ensuing years since then, like the way that most networks have moved is like you just stake, and then like when you want to stop staking, you do like an unbond type of transaction, and then like it counts down. So we took some of the learnings from running NuCypher and Keep, and try to simplify threshold staking in some of those ways to more closely align just with what stakers are used to from interacting on other networks, and how other networks have sort of what the direction that they've gone in. So there's more of like so Threshold does have that more like vanilla staking and then unbonding type mechanism. And then I think it was also an opportunity for the communities to basically rethink how they approached inflation. And in NuCypher, basically there was a pre-specified inflation curve and decay rate that was just hard-coded and locked in, more or less. Whereas in Threshold, I think we learned like there's value in having some ability to like turn the knobs on that. Not for us as a team to be able to do that, but for the DAO and for the token holders collectively to be able to be more responsive to market dynamics. So like if there's a new application, maybe you want to point additional rewards towards that application to help it bootstrap. If there's an oversupply of node operators at some certain point, maybe you want to pull back on inflation to kind of triangulate towards more your ideal number of node operators. So we built in some flexibility for the DAO to sort of more have more like explicit social authority to be able to do that, subject of course to like a vote and a DAO proposal. But that was one of the major changes there as well.
That's great. And then like for people who want to run a node on Threshold, like like who can participate there, and like how does it work in detail, and is there also like a delegation mechanism? And yeah, maybe walk us a bit through the details of like staking on Threshold.
Sure. So staking on Threshold is entirely permissionless. The minimum stake right now, and this is subject to DAO governance, so it can be tuned in the future, but currently the minimum stake is 40,000 T, so fairly approachable. And the way staking works is that you stake once into the network, and then you will authorize the different applications that you want to run. So let's say like you want to just maximize the rewards that you're making, and I expect this is what most people will do. They'll stake, and then they'll authorize all of the applications. So they'll authorize proxy re-encryption, they'll authorize the random beacon, they'll authorize TBTC, and you can reuse that stake across all applications. So it's not exclusive. You don't have to pick and choose. You can just do them all. And then once you've authorized, that basically means you've committed to operating a node for each of those applications. So in the short term, if you opted into all of them, you'd run the NuCypher code base for proxy re-encryption, you'd run the Keep code base for TBTC. And then I think our long-term vision is that there'll be some shared specification for the network at some point in the future, and each of the different clients would run all the applications. So we'd have a diversity of people running the NuCypher client and the Keep client, but those clients would run all the applications, but that's more of a longer term stretch goal. And so that's how that works. There's not delegation in the sense that like you can stake and then delegate to multiple people delegating to a single provider. But you can, of course, engage with like a staking infrastructure provider, of which there are many that operate on the NuCypher Keep and now Threshold networks, like Bison Trails, Figment, very many, and they can operate the node for you or on your behalf, and that would be not in a custodial way. So like you maintain control over your staking address, and you can like bond to a node that's operated by one of those providers. And then I expect there will probably also be some custodial pools, like there were for NuCypher. So CoinList, for example, ran a custodial pool where you could just basically send your tokens to them. They would stake them for you, take a cut of the rewards, and then distribute the rest. So I expect that there will be similar pool providers on Threshold. And theoretically, I think it would be possible to build like a semi-decentralized sort of pool if someone wanted to take that on as a project.
Call to action right there. Let's hear it, guys, in the chat. And just a quick reminder for everyone listening to today's episode, if you can just ask some questions in the chat. I see a lot of Korean comments pouring in. If you just save us some time and translate that into English, it would be definitely helpful for us. And MacLane, getting back into it here. So give us your best vision on what a world would look like in which Threshold Network is ultra successful.
Yeah, so I think our vision for Threshold is that we really want it to be it's a platform for Threshold cryptography. So I think Threshold cryptography has a ton of super interesting, compelling use cases, a lot of which we talked about today, for cross-chain asset bridges, for access control and data privacy, for like decentralized custodial type wallet type of applications. And we want basically to essentially have Threshold Network be the best platform to build any kind of Threshold cryptography application on top of. I think in the short term, obviously like TBTC and providing on-ramps to DeFi for Bitcoin is a huge focus for us. So I think we want to help make Bitcoin continue to succeed and provide opportunities to actually use Bitcoin beyond just passively hodling it, which is great. But like people want to take out loans. We want to basically increase the GDP of the Bitcoin ecosystem with TBTC. And then I think there's a ton of interesting projects right now building on proxy re-encryption. Just a few examples. Masterfile is building something called OpenDRM, which is sort of like a protocol for digital rights management. And so they're trying to onboard a lot of legacy companies and legacy brands that have very valuable IP that they might be a little bit reticent to like sort of put into the blockchain Web3 space. and giving them a way to do that more comfortably while maintaining some degree of control over their IP. So I think they're launching pretty soon, and that's a super interesting project. Another one building on PRE is Creaton, which is essentially a decentralized Patreon or decentralized OnlyFans, and they're helping creators monetize their content using that kind of like conditional access in exchange for payment that I mentioned before. Another one is NewLink, which is doing some interesting stuff with encrypted NFTs. So I think we want to just continue to provide this sort of best-in-class suite of developer tools for consuming threshold cryptography and making it easier for developers who aren't necessarily cryptographic experts to use threshold cryptography and basically have a set of nodes in the network that make that super, super easy for them to do.
That's amazing. And so like, what do you think is going to be like the biggest challenges for you, like in the go-to market, let's say? So like your strategy is like to really go like target developers and let people build applications on like make it easy for them to build applications on top of Threshold network. And like, what's the strategy there to like attract like those developers, and how are you going to achieve your goals?
Yeah, so I think you're absolutely right that we view Threshold as essentially like middleware or developer tools. And so it's very important for us to attract applications and developers to build those applications on top of the network. So we'll continue to do that. And we've had good success sponsoring hackathons, for example, like, the ETH Global events, and Masterfile actually came out of, I believe, last year's ETH Denver. So we'll continue to be highly engaged at hackathons and other sort of developer-oriented events in the space. But I think that is also the biggest challenge, is that if you're building an ecosystem or a tool for developers, you're to a certain extent, you're reliant on those developers to build a successful application that in turn gets end users that drive demand for the network. And so there's a little bit of sort of abstraction layer between you as the network and the end user that is challenging. So we will probably very likely continue to build some of our own applications as well that we think are compelling. I think TBTC was obviously one of the first examples of that. Threshold USD is another one that's community driven. But I believe we also are working on some ideas for proxy or encryption applications that either we will build as a development team ourselves, or maybe like put up as projects for the DAO and for community members to build. So we want to kind of shrink that distance between. We don't want to be as reliant on third-party developers necessarily to have to build a successful application. Although that in the long term, of course, that is sort of the fundamental purpose of Threshold, is we need to attract those developers and we need them to build successful apps.
Build out the community and benefit from the network effect. Absolutely. And what is, in your opinion, the future of other privacy tokens such as Zcash, Monero, etc.? Do you think those will still play a role here in the future?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think so. Threshold does not focus on like transaction privacy. So it plays in a very different space than does Zcash and Monero, which I think are both very, very interesting projects. I mean, again, like I said before, like I think Zcash is super, super interesting. I hope that, I think they were one of the first examples of like, hey, like you can take very novel new cryptographic primitives and deploy them in production and get pretty significant adoption in the blockchain space relative to any other space. So I think that was sort of a great sort of initial sort of proof point and inspiration for a lot of us that came after Zcash to sort of start trying to deploy these novel cryptographic primitives in the blockchain space. I think now we're starting to see a lot of projects use ZKPs for trying to create private smart contracts. There's actually a super interesting project by a former NuCypher team member that's pre-launch, but they're using fully homomorphic encryption to kind of improve on this idea of using ZKPs for private smart contracts, and they'll probably be announcing more about what they're doing pretty soon. So that's an interesting one to keep an eye on as well.
Pretty cool. And like, what do you think? Like, what's going to be the relation between like a transactional privacy and like computational privacy, or like like something like Threshold Network, like are they going to work together in some way, or can they be complementary to each other?
Sure. I mean, I could definitely imagine after TBTC V2 is launched, like I think it would be super interesting to launch a TZEC or like a T Monero. So like bridging Zcash or Monero over into the DeFi space and providing yield opportunities for those tokens as well. So I would say that's something that we've thought about a little bit, but there's certainly a lot of potential areas for collaboration there.
Yeah, absolutely. And now I want to excite the audience watching yet again. I want to see some emoji reactions in the chat here. We have a slight bit of an announcement here. Some of you might already know this, but there are applications going live imminently on the Threshold network, including proxy re-encryption in the next week or two. Stakers will be able to run nodes on the Threshold network and more applications in the coming months. So, MacLane, do you want to just talk more about this announcement and more about the proxy re-encryption coming very soon here?
Yep. So like when I was describing like the staking model for Threshold before, right now you can stake into the Threshold network, but there are no deployed applications yet to authorize to. So in the next week or so, we'll be deploying proxy re-encryption as the first staking app. And at that point, stakers will be able to authorize the proxy re-encryption app, and they'll be able to start running these proxy re-encryption nodes and providing proxy re-encryption as a service to users of the network. And actually, one of the major differences between proxy re-encryption on NuCypher versus proxy re-encryption on Threshold is that in NuCypher, everything was ETH L1. So if you wanted to use proxy re-encryption as a developer and grant and revoke access to encrypted data, there was unfortunately a very significant gas fee associated with that. So you'd have to pay essentially like $50 in gas to grant and revoke, even though like the actual policy itself you were paying to the network was probably like a cent or less. So basically, like, unfortunately, when we were building NuCypher, we didn't anticipate, what ultimately ended up happening with Ethereum, and it almost became like economically unfeasible to use PRE on L1. So proxy encryption on Threshold, the granting and revoking aspect, specifically the policy manager contract, will actually live. The first one will live on Polygon, and then we'll also be deploying that policy manager contract on other L2s going forward. So we'll be taking that that $50 transaction gas fee down to hopefully just a few cents. And I think we're very excited for that to open up a lot of or make proxy encryption more economically and financially feasible for many more applications than it was before.
Amazing, great stuff. Really looking forward to the next months here as well, especially the staking going live soon as well. And then guys, like if you still have questions, just drop it in the chat here. We're going to move over to community questions now. So if you got anything, just drop it in the chat. Also, if you can keep it English, that would be very helpful. And like we have a question here from the Artful Dodger asking about the recommended specs for running a node. So yeah, maybe you can walk us through that, like who can run a node, what are the requirements, and so on.
Yep. So this is actually a little bit tricky of a question to answer because of the way that Threshold is a modular application network. So the specs and the requirements for running a node will actually depend on, will vary from application to application. So the specs that you need to run a proxy encryption node might be different from the specs that you need to run a random beacon node or a TBTC signer or some other future application. And so like as those applications launch, we'll have more details on like the minimum specs for each of the applications. Although I will say in general, like Threshold is focused on threshold cryptography. And in practice, that means for the most part, elliptic curve cryptography, which is not particularly computationally intensive. So this is not, you don't have to buy like some crazy mining rig in general to stake and run nodes on Threshold. I know with proxy encryption, people were able to pretty easily do it with, in some cases, like the free tier instance on on different cloud providers. So it is generally like pretty accessible. but the exact specs will vary from application to application.
And there's a very nice dashboard available that has links to all the docs needed to run these nodes. So feel free, everyone watching, to dig into the docs as well. And we have a next question here. Can I participate in coverage pools as well as staking T natively?
Right. So coverage pools and staking T are mutually exclusive. So when you stake T, that you can authorize all the different applications on the network, but coverage pools is not a staking application. So coverage pools is its own smart contract. You would deposit into that smart contract, and then you would earn yield in exchange for basically putting up your collateral as kind of this insurance backstop. But you can't do both with the same token. You would need to choose one or the other.
Cool. Do you have any estimates on like the different types of incentives between like those two options there, or?
Yeah, so there's actually I believe it's on the governance forum. So there's a pretty long discussion on how incentives or the inflation subsidy will look like on Threshold. I can try to find it after the call. But the short of it is that we want to make sure that it's economically viable for smaller stakers to survive and be able to be net positive by running a node and not just get bled out over time. So there's this stable yield mechanism where we try to target at least a minimum yield percentage, regardless of how many other people in the network are staking. And I believe the initial target that's being discussed right now is around 10% if you are authorizing all the applications on the network. And then coverage pools, coverage pools hasn't been discussed as much yet what the yield for that will look like. But given that it is more of a passive activity that doesn't require the active management of running a node, I assume it would be some lesser amount than the max yield you would get for staking and running a node.
And what are we looking at for an unbonding time, average unbonding time with Threshold?
Yeah, so this also varies application to application. I think there will be a global minimum unbonding time, but applications will have the ability to specify some longer unbonding time potentially if needed. But the global unbonding time period right now is 2 months. And these are all semi-provisional numbers, of course, because the applications haven't been officially deployed yet. So they could change a little bit until then.
Awesome. This is some really good information here. It looks like we've run through all the community questions. So MacLane, where can people go to find more about the stuff you're working on and more about Threshold Network?
Yep. So definitely check us out on threshold.network is the website. And I think there's a big revamp coming soon with a bunch more information and content that'll be there soon. If you're interested in getting engaged with the community and the DAO, so we didn't really talk about this today, but the Threshold DAO has a very significant treasury that it's deploying pretty aggressively as we start to deploy and scale these applications. And so there's a marketing guild, there's a treasury guild, there's an integrations guild. There'll probably be a developers guild at some point for people that wanting to build applications. You can, and all the day-to-day sort of work of the DAO happens in Discord. And so that's discord.gg/threshold. So definitely hop in there if you want to chat with us or potentially do stuff for the DAO. And then on Twitter, the marketing guild runs our Twitter handle. It's at the T Network as well.
Is there any specific application developers you are looking for? Who are you planning to fund with the treasury? Do you have any strategy there, or
So funding developers with the treasury is more of a case-by-case basis. But we're very interested in people building on proxy encryption. We're also very interested in people building essentially banking or financial primitives for Bitcoin. So Threshold USD is a community project that is funded by the DAO. So we do have a track record of being able to essentially allocate funds for community projects.
Very cool. You guys heard it here first on Staking Mondays, a call for the Threshold DAO applications. Look forward to seeing what will be built in the coming years, coming months, for sure. And for everyone watching, be sure to check out previous episodes of Staking Mondays available on YouTube and Spotify. Subscribe to our channel, like this video, and feel free to share it around to all your friends as well. Thank you so much, MacLane here, for joining us today. And as always, guys, happy staking. Take care.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, guys.